What is? Thank you. Thank you for indulging us in our music festival this evening. And welcome to the Carl Gayweiler Great Decisions Program Series of the Indiana Council of World Affairs for 2022. This is our second to the last program of this 8-part series. And this evening we have Dr. Sameeksha Desai, and she's going to be talking about industrial policy. And I think this year, some of you have gotten used to before our Zoom programs that we like to play some music before we get started. And it just helps as you're sitting in the waiting room and you're staring at nothing except perhaps our logo. We thought maybe some music, and particularly if it's music that can be in alignment with that evening's topic. And so we took a look at industrial policy and we thought, well, what kind of music? It's not referring to particular countries, so there's no country music, and it was kind of hard. And even though it's not necessarily about work, when we hear this evening's program, and for those of us who read the article in the publication, there is work associated with industry and industrial policy. And we said we hope our speaker has a good sense of humor. We hope you do too. And we thought, well, what can be more related? I was thinking, first of all, I've been working on the railroad. And I spoke with Claire, who this evening found our speaker, and we thought, well, there's Joe Hill, which is a labor organizing song. And then we were talking some more and we thought, well, let's have some fun with this. And we thought, hi ho, it's off to work we go. So if some of you tuned in early, you might have thought, oh my God, I'm tuned into the Disney Channel. What's happening here? Or maybe if you turned on later, you might have thought you were listening to the CNN clip from the 1960s. They do that 60s and 70s and 80s series. And perhaps you thought you were in the 60s series and were watching part of Woodstock, but you are here at the Indiana Council of World Affairs. So thank you for joining with us. And we actually had some fun. We hope you did too. And maybe you brought back some good memories. And I think most of you would remember Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. If you've not, well, it's not exactly what Disney does these days, but it was kind of fun. So thank you very much. We have a great program lined up for this evening. We're very glad you've been able to join with us. And we're really going to just go right into the program here very shortly with Claire introducing. My name is Dr. Betty Tonsing. I'm part of this committee. And if my committee members would say hi, Diane Farrell, Claire Collins, who will be introducing our speaker, and Ray Montagna Dr. Ray Montagna will once again be doing the Q&A. And for those of you who've been with us for most of this year or even new, we will have, our speaker will talk for about 40 minutes. She'll have a PowerPoint, and we'll know a lot more about industrial policy than we might know right now. It's a subject that I think we probably have a lot of questions about. And then we're going to have, as usual, a very robust Q&A. I would encourage you, for those of you who have questions, to please ask your own. I know that speakers really do like to engage with audiences. So if you can please do that. The other option is to send your question to Ray, and we'll go over this again when we go into the Q&A period. Do not send the question to everybody. Ray's name is in the chat, and if you look for Ray Montagna, you'll see his name and send it to him. But again, I do encourage you. We don't encourage people to launch off on their own speech, but we do encourage people to please ask their own question. Before I went again, I want to thank many of you. I looked over the names. I've seen several new names and very familiar names. Next week will be our last. It is whatever the date next April. It's April the 5th, and that'll be it until next year. And I think by then, unless we nosedive into another very serious virus, which is now we know to be very possible, we will probably be going back to live again, but we want to do hybrid programs. We have been very thrilled to have the opportunity to do virtual programming. And I think we all feel that there are different platforms for that, but the Zoom is a very user-friendly and very interactive. And we want to make this hybrid because we know many of you enjoy the opportunity to come because of the virtual possibility. And some of you are also very anxious to get back to live because it's just really fun also to be around people. And we've done this from the very beginning. We made the decision. We had charged a very modest fee for our programs before. And we decided with Zoom, we would not charge a fee because it seemed that many others were not. And we didn't want to do something that might detract from an audience. And so we've been very, very pleased to be able to offer this to you. But I'm going to make a plea once again for you to please consider a membership in the Indiana Council of World Affairs. The programs, we feel that the program series this past year, and the one that's brought to you by distinguished speakers, has brought to you really outstanding programs, fantastic speakers. And while our costs are minimal, we do have costs. And there will be costs to doing this. We don't want to just sort of do it in a clunky way. We really want to be able to do our hybrid programs, but it feels for those of you who are Zooming in and those in the audience that you are there, that we really are all together. And we really want to keep things robust and as interactive, as engaging as possible. And that's going to be able to take the right technology. And there's just costs in identifying our speakers and bringing this to you. So your membership is extremely important to us. It also tells us as we go to funders and corporate sponsors to support us, if we can turn around and say, well, we have these members and they support what we're doing, it speaks loudly also to that as well, because they'll ask that, well, how many people are members? How many people care? If you care about what we're doing, we just ask you to please consider a membership. It's very modest, maybe add a donation on top of that. That would be so appreciated and would help us continue presenting the excellence of programs we've been able to do. And with that, I am very curious to know more about industrial policy, and our speaker I know is very anxious to present that to you. So Claire, may I ask you to please introduce our speaker?
Yes. I'm on? Yes. Okay. Dr. Sameeksha Desai joined the faculty of the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University in Bloomington in 2010. She specializes in entrepreneurship, competitiveness, and economic development policy. She's an associate professor there, and she is director of the Manufacturing Policy Initiative and associate director, Institute for Development Strategies. Her research explores the conditions that influence entrepreneurship and regional economic outcomes of various types of entrepreneurial activity and opportunity. She has received numerous awards, fellowships, and grants, while her work has been supported by government, nonprofit, and international organizations. And I'm so glad she likes to be called Sammy. So welcome, Dr. Sammy Desai. You're on mute.
All right. Hi. Hello, everybody. It is so nice to be here. And I am just trying to figure out how to share my slides. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the invitation. As Claire mentioned, I work on manufacturing quite a bit, and I work actually at the intersection of entrepreneurship and innovation, technology policy, and manufacturing. And so the things that I'm principally interested in are how we can shore up the US entrepreneurship and innovation ecosystem and what that means for our foreign relations, and particularly now for national security. I think COVID has really highlighted the relationship between these areas. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have a couple of slides, not too many, I hope. Okay, perfect. Can you see that? Okay. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So the reading in the Great Decisions booklet was really fascinating. And I think probably the most interesting thing about it was it really makes a direct connection between our domestic economy and where we are with competition and competitiveness and our national security in the United States. And this is interesting because we don't often see it play out in the policy sense, right? So we typically see domestic initiatives around manufacturing, around technology, and around even the production of goods relevant to national security take place really as domestic conversations. And then we think about things like trade and competition with China, and global policy and foreign policy as a different bucket of work. And what I want to do here is talk about why they're relevant to each other, and also specifically about what types of policies and challenges we see in the domestic US economy for entrepreneurship in manufacturing that can really play a role in evening things out and improving our ability in this country to deal with some of the changing global conditions, particularly with China. So, all right, so I just put this up here because I thought it was really useful. And I wanted to highlight just this last part, which is the United States can implement policies dealing with trade and the economy, and they're not mutually exclusive. So we don't have to sacrifice investing in domestic infrastructure for competition and investing in relationships abroad. The other thing that I think is really interesting about this statement as well is that there is a big can we do it question. So we actually have a lot of data and a lot of evidence on not only what the challenges are, but also what works. But this fundamental question of trust as well as competence is really probably what's going to drive how things look over the next 10, 15, 30 years. So I'm going to make just some brief remarks, and then I hope we can go to discussion. So the first thing I wanted to just walk through is China's industrial priorities. So this is Made in China 2025. I think most people have seen this, but if you haven't, this is basically a list of the 10 targeted sectors that are real priorities, all of them, of course, relevant to manufacturing and or in manufacturing. And these are really the areas that China has targeted to shore up and to increase global competition and dominance in. So very briefly, next-gen information technology. This is something that we see playing out everywhere. High-end computerized machines and robotics, aerospace development. This is a really big area for production. Maritime equipment in high-tech ships, advanced trains and railway equipment, energy saving, motor vehicles. This is probably the area that we hear about the most. Energy efficient equipment, agricultural equipment, new materials and processes, and then biopharma and state-of-the-art medical devices. So I don't think any of the things on this list should really be surprising. What is particularly noteworthy about the things on this list is the intersection between technology, R&D, new technologies, including things like AI, as well as military and security sector activities. So if you look at some of the items on this list, like aerospace development, biopharma, as well as the advanced transportation sectors, these are all things that are of significant importance to military dominance. And so what you see here, I think, is this sort of real marriage between economic and military military priorities. And so that has really changed the way that the US has to respond and compete. And we really can't, and I think the Great Decisions book talked about this very convincingly, we really can't think about our domestic economy and what happens with competition abroad as two distinct areas in the policy domain. So I want to really talk a little bit about the relevance and importance of US entrepreneurship and innovation. We've seen this as an area of concern over the last 3 decades in the United States. It's referred to sometimes as reversing the startup decline, reversing the entrepreneurship decline. I've seen it talked about as the startup slump, but basically this area in particular, as it relates to semiconductors, but manufacturing more broadly, is an area of, I think, significant promise when we think about what industrial policy might be, could be, would be, even should be in the United States, and how that ties into our ability to compete, particularly with China. So before I get into that, I want to just talk through 2 kind of clusters of interventions that are relevant to a industrial policy type approach. And so the first is what you would consider really targeted interventions. And those are vertical interventions that would focus on specific industries and firms. And that's what we see in the Made in China 2025 approach, right? And that is very much focused on improving very specific identified industries. And of course, there are going to be identified firms in those industries. So those types of interventions would include the things that we would typically think about, like investment directly by the state, changing your procurement requirements, reforming, for example, the system of public procurement to focus on specific firms and industries. Tariffs are the common one that we would think about, and trade restrictions. And then, of course, direct subsidies, tax credit exemptions for both consumers and producers to stimulate specific industries, and then currency manipulation, which we've seen particularly in the context of China. So that's really the vertical kind of targeted approach. And then we also see this broader approach, and we see that in the United States quite a bit. And that is really this idea of transforming the overall business environment so that you're creating a more robust and competitive economy. And so that would include things, and this is in the Great Decisions book, but that would include things like shoring up the leaks for firms. And so that would be things like, the cost of access to infrastructure, the cost of access to things that could be provided through public spending that all companies would take advantage of, and not necessarily specific ones. Public spending on R&D is probably one of the most common debates that we see right now domestically, and that is really about encouraging particularly new businesses, or being able for new businesses in particular to be able to participate and not only engage in R&D, but actually then take successful innovations to market, scale up, and expand. But it also includes some of the really big problems that we're facing right now that COVID has highlighted for us. They existed for a long time, but COVID really showed us how important it is to address them. So one of them is the labor market. So strengthening education and worker training. And in particular, when we talk about who has access to not just jobs, but opportunities that could lead to new business activity, particularly in industries like manufacturing that can have high startup costs and that can have quite a bit of new activity based on existing jobs in the industry. So there's a lot of learning that takes place, and we know this from research. And so people who have jobs in manufacturing companies may see opportunities to create new companies to commercialize something that isn't already being done. So that kind of pathway into the labor market is an example of a transformative approach to shoring up the domestic environment for entrepreneurship. Improving infrastructure for manufacturing, this is key, of course. And so that includes the traditional types of infrastructure, but also digital and cyber infrastructure are, of course, the new big question mark, particularly for small manufacturing companies, because access to those types of infrastructure is important and also expensive. Labor market flexibility, this is similar to education and worker training, but this is really about broader barriers in the economy. And so this is one reason right now you hear from manufacturing companies a lot that they can't retain workers. And one of the big issues is that labor market flexibility. During COVID, we saw how important caregiving was to allowing people to stay in the workforce. And that's a really big source of tension for manufacturing companies that need to scale in order to meet production requirements, in order to be competitive, particularly for export markets. So we really are thinking about how hiring at and the micro level are affecting what the US is able to do in light of what China is doing. Public-private partnerships, so this is really referring to mechanisms of service delivery, steering investment through national development banks that are not directly controlled by government. And then the traditional one that we see and hear a lot about is around corporate taxation. So these are examples of the types of horizontal interventions that we might see that would fall more broadly within an industrial policy approach that aims at structural change, as opposed to targeting sectors and firms individually, right? And that's also often called picking winners. And I don't have a perspective or an opinion on what's better. I just wanted to share both approaches. So everyone, I think by now, is familiar with the 2021 report, the supply chain report that came out of the Biden administration. And in that report, 4 industries in particular were identified as really critical. And semiconductor manufacturing and advanced packaging was one of them. We have seen more than a 50% decline over the last 20 years in the US production of semiconductors in the global market. So this is a huge decline and a really big problem. The other 3 were critical minerals and materials, pharmaceutical and active pharmaceutical ingredients, and then large capacity batteries. So all of these are all of these are areas in which entrepreneurship and innovation really actually hold the base of industry growth. And so we don't want to neglect that very early growth. The report also explicitly called out the importance of the US innovation ecosystem. And so in particular, talking about making sure that world-class universities, research centers, startups, and incubators are really a big part of not only policy efforts, but what becomes, a sustaining innovation ecosystem that allows us to reverse some of the damage that we've seen that has left the United States particularly vulnerable to Chinese competition in manufacturing. And so what are some of these challenges? So the first one is we have an idea in the United States that entrepreneurship and innovation just flourish. And that's not actually the case. So we need entrepreneurship and innovation because new businesses create almost all net new jobs. And these jobs are in many ways important, not only for those businesses, but they also play an important role in skilling our workforce. So for example, new and young businesses tend to hire younger workers. And in manufacturing, that tells us a lot about who is actually training and investing in the future of the US workforce. And so new businesses also put the competitive pressures that all industries need into place. And so the threat of entry, in addition to actual entry, force competitors to innovate more, create welfare gains. And so those are the types of things that we get from a robust and competitive entrepreneurial environment. We also see that technology-enabled industrial transformation comes from new businesses. And it's really important for us to think about new businesses and small businesses and how they might be different in our policy environment. And so when we're thinking in particular about tech-enabled or tech-dependent, expanding new businesses, we're talking about a very particular type of promising, potentially high growth new business that is the kind that can expand across industries. And so when we think about things like the technologies that you need for manufacturing smart tractors, when we think about the use of AI in product development, when we think about even the use of technology in securing or in making our supply chains more efficient, all of those things come from innovation, and a lot of that is linked to new business activity. But there are a couple of challenges. And so, we don't think about this a lot when we think about competition with China, but they are directly related. So we've seen 3 pretty troubling trends in the United States economy over the last 2 or 3 decades. The first one is that the share of new businesses that actually become employers, so the ones that create jobs, has declined. The second is that early stage new businesses, so those within the first year of survival, are hiring less. And what's interesting about that is survival rates have not actually fluctuated all that much. There have been, specific events, but over time, survival rates have stayed relatively consistent, but the volume of hiring has actually declined. And then it also takes longer for a new business that does become an employer to make that first hire. And so we see this sort of shrinking as well as a slowing of the entrepreneurial sector in the United States. And so I'll just run you through a couple of quick images. I want to be mindful of time. A couple of quick images. So the first one, these are from the Kauffman Foundation Indicators of Entrepreneurship. So the first one is the rate of new employer business actualization. So this is actually the share of new businesses that make a first payroll within 8 quarters of the time they apply to become a new business. So this is a really important number because this tells us about the state of hiring as well as scaling in these new businesses. For manufacturing businesses, this is particularly important because if you're going to make something, you need employees, and it is really crucial to be able to get those people in. So what we've seen, I think, is pretty shocking, and that is that there has been a decline of more than half. And 2020 is unfortunately the latest data that I could pull from the website, but we've seen a decline of more than half of new businesses. So basically in the past, 1 in 5 new business applications led to job creation within 8 quarters. And now we're seeing that it's less than 10%. And a lot of this is due to cost, right? And I'll talk about that more in a second. The second trend is that the average number of jobs that's created by a startup in the first year has also declined. And so it used to be just under 8 in 1996, and we see that by 2020, we're we're just right around 5. And so that's also a pretty substantial decline when you think about the aggregate numbers. And then this last piece is the hiring piece. And so this basically shows us that over time, since 2005, it has actually taken new businesses longer to make that first hire. And so we see now that it takes just over 2 quarters. But in 2005, it took just a little over 1.5 quarters. That doesn't seem like a lot. I know when we think in quarter terms, but when we think in day terms, that's actually a lot, particularly for a small manufacturing company that is operating on receipts that might not have cash flow to cover quite a bit of time. And so this is also a third disturbing trend. And so collectively, these 3 things and several other trends, but collectively, these 3 things really sort of highlight the priority that entrepreneurship and innovation actually they have had in the last few administrations and should have when we're thinking not only about industrial policy, but also our ability to compete abroad. And so this is from a 2021 assessment of a survey of new businesses. It says my screen sharing is paused. I hope you can still see it. This is basically survey results from surveys with new businesses about what the most challenging things are in scaling. And finding customers was the top biggest problem. Finding skilled employees was the next biggest problem. And that's over 50% of new businesses have a hard time finding skilled employees. This was done, I believe, pre-pandemic. And this has only gotten worse. We hear from manufacturing companies every day that they can't find enough people in to work. They can't find the right match for a specific job with the talent set that they have available. And then we also see, of course, the standard question of capital market challenges, which are really funds both to grow and to start the business. So if we look at this set of things and we think about, in particular, cost-intensive, capital-intensive businesses like those in manufacturing, this really shows us why we've seen so much difficulty for manufacturers to scale. And I think it's really important that we think about the difference between starting and scaling. Because historically, entrepreneurship policy, and particularly the policies focused on competitiveness, have focused on starting. And we've thought a lot about how do you get more people to start that business? Can you make registration easier? Can you make it easier to incorporate? But we haven't thought about what happens after. And that is where we see a lot of challenges, because that's where things become, first of all, very expensive. You have to hire, you have to maintain cash flow, you have to get professional management. But second of all, that's where we actually see these new businesses no longer are new and important, and they have to compete with long established businesses in some cases, and they don't have access to the types of policy support that we see new businesses within their first year have. So those first few years are really, really important, and scaling is really important in manufacturing. So where do we see dropping off? So this is from a survey that I did when I was at the Kauffman Foundation a few years ago. And this really looked at the group of people who would be potential future business owners and where, but did not actually start a business, and why they didn't start a business. And the top concern was survival. Time was also a concern, loss of focus and burnout. But then we saw a really interesting cluster of things that are very much what you would consider policy amenable. So family considerations and maintaining things like maintaining income in a household, personal health, illness and injury, access to health insurance, and then other types of labor market things. Like, for example, I needed to get a job because I have to pay rent, and my new business will need a few months to be profitable, so I can't actually afford to do it. So this raises a very interesting question, and something that we see that is in direct contrast, may not be the best word, but something that is directly relevant to what we see China doing. And so one of the things that we see with China is that targeted attempts to support businesses or targeted attempts to support specific industries often focus on cost. And so in particular, there are non-competitive initially firms or industries where the pressure for short-term profits is alleviated by government policy action, right? And so that is a very interesting mechanism because it takes some of that pressure off and it allows those firms to invest and to be able to achieve medium to longer term growth without worrying about bringing in profits in the short term. So that as a policy is actually something that directly targets some of the biggest pain points for new businesses and is something that's very difficult to compete with. So when we look at where we see, potential American entrepreneurs dropping off, we actually see that, quite a few of these things are directly related to cost, including things like survival and time concerns. So that's just a really interesting thing that stands out to me as sort of a difference in focus between the two countries. So a couple of challenges for U.S. entrepreneurship and innovation specific to manufacturing. And, the first one is capital markets. Financing for high-risk projects, innovation, and production is really tough. In general, for new businesses, I think the most recent annual survey of entrepreneurs showed us that something like 83% of new business owners receive no external institutional financing. So neither private equity, like venture capital, but also bank loans. And so when you're talking about the difference between an accountant setting up a new business that can be run out of an office that doesn't require, for example, massive production facilities or the acquisition of technology, you can see that in particular for manufacturing, capital markets are a really big constraint for new businesses. It's also noteworthy that the dominance of small businesses in manufacturing also raise questions of expansion and access to capital to be able to expand and increase production capability. So the other big area of challenge is STEM and R&D. So we're seeing that competitiveness in the United States, of course, we know has been a big challenge, and particularly around not only who does R&D, but also the commercialization of that R&D work. And so we've seen programs like the SBIR program, which are really meant to help with that commercialization, but we see so much leakage, particularly in the transfer of technology and innovations that are created in universities and in research institutions, making it into the marketplace. So this is both about not only who is in R&D and who is working, particularly in manufacturing, but also how what they are doing actually makes it into the marketplace. And then the two last points are pretty specific to entrepreneurship. And one is who actually has business opportunity. And so this is both a labor market question as well as an economic opportunity question. It is very relevant for things like semiconductor manufacturing, technology-enabled manufacturing, because the flow of people into starting these new businesses that will grow in the future is severely constrained by things like geography, by things like the wealth gap and by things like where people have access to training and access to jobs. And so those dimensions are really crucial when we think about our broader, potential industrial policy in the United States. And then the last piece is scaling and production. So it's not enough that US businesses, for example, are actually innovating here. They have to be able to produce the goods here too. Innovation in the United States doesn't always necessarily lead to jobs created around that innovation and production and to capturing the supply chain here. And so, these are 4 challenges for U.S. entrepreneurship and innovation in manufacturing. There is reason to be optimistic. I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. And so I want to share with you the trend. This is from the business formation statistics that the Department of the Census tracks. And this is the trend annually in new business applications in manufacturing. And what we've actually seen, and I think this should come as no surprise, it's been
Sammy, your slides are not advancing.
Oh, okay. Where? Huh.
Last thing you had was.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. So what we've seen a lot in the news is, of course, this increase in entrepreneurship more generally. But what I think is really remarkable is COVID has, and the supply chain disruption has really pushed many companies, including new companies in manufacturing, into a type of reset. So if we look at what we saw even 10 years ago, we saw, fairly low, but somewhat fluctuating levels of new business activity. If you look at what happened in 2021, this is pretty remarkable. So this is a massive increase in the number of new business applications in manufacturing that were filed in the United States. That's really promising. I think we have a lot of cause for optimism, but where it gets tricky is we now see, right, we don't want that 10% number. So we don't want to think about only 10% of these new businesses might hire, which is what we have seen in recent years. And so the big question is, how do these businesses actually survive and how do they scale? And when they are using technology and creating jobs, in particular technology, and they're well primed to access export markets, what is the role of domestic policy in facilitating or enabling that, if at all? I'll show you another quick, can you see this one, Ray? Yeah, okay. And so this is the trend line. This is month to month for the last 3 years. And what you'll see again here is for most months, the trend in 2021 for manufacturing was actually quite positive. And so that gives us a lot of hope, I think, for what is going to happen in the future. But fundamentally, it's a precarious situation for a lot of these new businesses if we don't have a policy environment that provides enough incentive or support for them to be able to actually grow and scale, particularly in targeted sectors. So I just want to share this really quick piece about entrepreneurship policy and industrial policy. So the importance of entrepreneurship to U.S. competitiveness cannot be highlighted enough. It really is the bedrock of our competitiveness in industries like manufacturing, but particularly those 10 industries that China has listed. Entrepreneurship is crucial. Startup costs are high, but we have the talent. It's just a matter of, and I say just, but it's much harder, but it is a matter of unlocking that talent and unlocking those resources to be able to get people into new businesses, help those new businesses thrive in an environment where they can be competitive, and then eliminate the barriers that exist in communities, particularly rural communities that could host more manufacturing, that already host manufacturing, eliminate the barriers for people to get into those jobs. When people get into those manufacturing jobs, they immediately become part of the broader production ecosystem, and then that creates opportunities to create new products, to innovate, and then to sort of, create this virtual circle of new businesses starting from new businesses. So a couple of just brief things to connect us back to the micro level. Entrepreneurs come from the population and people can move in and out of business ownership. And so labor market fluidity is really important. Who is exposed? And I think rural development is very relevant to this question, but who is exposed to opportunity and can act on it? In manufacturing, barriers exist from the start to the end of a business life cycle. We know that if you're a welder, there are jobs waiting for you. But we also know that if you're a welder that faces caregiving constraints or has, for example, a drug conviction on your record, then it's going to be really hard for you to get into a job and stay in a job. We know that if you are working in in the trades, we know that if you're in R&D, you're going to face a lot of constraints that are just broadly general to the labor market that are also hurting our critical manufacturing needs. And so in manufacturing in particular, labor market fluidity has both firm competitiveness implications, but also much more broader economy implications. So the last piece is, can we do it? Can we actually create a much more robust environment for US innovation in entrepreneurship and manufacturing? I don't have the answer. I just want to identify two things that I think are really going to be make or break type questions for the United States, particularly given that China is pursuing both a cost-based as well as a technology acquisition strategy to achieve manufacturing dominance. So the first one is our capital market alignment is inadequate for the types of business needs that manufacturers have, particularly new manufacturers. And that requires a fundamental rethink of how manufacturing new businesses are financed. And the second is finding a way to plug the leakage of technology innovation and getting that innovation out into the market, making sure that that innovation is actually taken as far as it can go. So I'm going to stop there and thank you.
Thank you. I think Ray will go right into our Q&A. Ray, are you ready?
Now I'm ready.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Sammy. That was a very, very interesting presentation. I have a few questions here, but I'd like to start out with one. The study that you did looking at challenges that new startups are facing, how does that compare with, say, 20 years ago? Are those the same kinds of challenges that folks encountered then, and the level of them the same?
Yeah, so we didn't do the same study 20 years ago, but one of the things that we've seen where all of these points of connection are made is around hiring and the cost of hiring. And so I'll have to look up the specific numbers, but I did look at the cost, for example, of even recruitment, finding the right talent, and getting people into a job. That has increased significantly. The cost of health insurance, of course, has gone up, and that's a big cost for particularly new business owners. And so it really seems to be, at least a big component seems to be around this employee-employer sort of dance right at the start of hiring for the first few employees. It's expensive to hire. And we also think about jobs in the way, in a one-sided way where, and that's changing now, but we've traditionally thought about jobs as I'm an employer offering a job. And so here are all the things I'm giving you. But when you think about jobs at startups, some people view them as very risky, right? And so a lot of employees also will be asking questions like, well, what kind of benefits am I going to get? And so it can be difficult to attract good employees more broadly, not in some specific, particularly tech-based startups, but it can be difficult to attract that first employee. Can be expensive. And so it really seems to be around this question of, can you actually get employees in the door and then retain them? The cost of training is really high. And that also becomes a risk for hiring.
So as you were talking about this, I was wondering if the types of businesses, especially manufacturing today, are more complicated and difficult than they were 30, 40 years ago, which makes the kind of those initial phases more difficult to go through.
Yeah. So I think, and I'm not an engineer, so I can't say if material sciences has changed or, but I think what we see are these two dynamics where manufacturing has transformed so much that the type of hiring that's needed has also shifted. And so when we think now about, for example, COVID pushing particularly small and medium-sized manufacturers to embrace technology that they might not have done at the time that they did, right? Because hiring was so difficult. That basically, so that may be good. Some people I think that's a good thing. And perhaps it is, but I think that tells us that, the next looming question is who's going to manage that technology? And are they going to be able to bring the right types of, AI human experts that can deal with that, or the right types of technically trained people that can supervise, oversee, fix, and improve that technology in manufacturing companies. So I think the nature of manufacturing has changed, but we've also seen that manufacturing has had to compete with other industries for good talent. And again, that's not something we think about a lot. We often think about manufacturers having jobs. We don't think about, I'm a talented individual and I could work at any of these 5 places, right? I don't have to work in a manufacturing company. And that is something that we've seen change also, is the more broad applicability of skills that an individual might have to work in, several different types of companies and functions.
All right, thank you. So John Marquis had a question here. This is about electric vehicles. And he read an article recently that in China, some manufacturers are actually making battery substitution approaches as opposed to recharging batteries by the individual. What kind of implications does that have for kind of the infrastructure development in the United States? Should we be building charging stations, or should we be building battery swapping stations?
Yeah. That I don't know. I mean, I think we have to play the long game. And we're seeing this real tension between energy and production. And I don't really have an answer. I don't know what the numbers look like. But I think playing the long game will get us out of this constant trying to get ahead and trying to catch up. So if I had to, again, I can't say for sure, but if I had to bet, I would bet on the long game.
Okay, I actually have a comment there, John. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add something to that, John.
Oh, it's this in the chat.
You're still muted there, John. Yeah.
I'd just like to ask, what do you think is the long game? Is the long game going to be the replace batteries or recharging batteries?
I'm going to say this and then be wrong. I think recharging batteries is probably the long game. That's, if I were making the investment, that's where I would go. But it's risky to comment on that.
Yeah, well, I agree with you there. And John, I just have a suggestion for you. There's a YouTube channel by a guy called the Electric Viking, who has dozens and dozens of videos on EVs. And he's done a lot. He's from Australia, and he's done a lot of analysis of the Chinese market. And he's got several episodes on this battery swapping thing versus charging. So you might want to check that out. It's called the Electric Viking. Sorry to jump in there, Sammy.
No. And I actually just noticed that at some point, it looks like my slides disappeared. So I'm not sure. I'll send them over.
Yeah, so if you send that to Claire, and we'll make sure that they're available to our audience. There's a question from Nat Whitney, he wanted to know, and this is kind of a question for the ages, if entrepreneurs are successful at creating more efficient production, won't that decrease employment?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think what we've seen is that, a lot of new businesses come from opportunities created by new businesses. So we should actually see the sort of virtuous circle where, you have more new businesses, people work in them, they see more opportunities to expand the industry. And then that also then leads to more and more new businesses forming and growing. And then from an employment perspective, I think what we've seen is that we see shifting employment. So shifts in the nature of the jobs that are created and the nature of the needs to fill those jobs, but not necessarily that we would see, a sudden or even a slow decline in actual job creation. In fact, I think, more effective scaling by new businesses would be many new businesses die for reasons that are not necessarily related to the technology or the product being not competitive or bad, right? And so cost is a really big factor, and often it's the personal and household circumstances of the entrepreneur that affect business decision making. And so I think actually if we saw more of that, we would really see this greater innovation, more R&D, and we would see the development of industry clusters too, that would really help with manufacturing in regional competitiveness.
To follow up on that, Indiana, just as an example, is probably not a hotbed for venture capital. I mean, is the concentration of venture capital on the coast a problem for entrepreneurial development in the United States?
Yeah, yes and no. So Indiana did recently get a Smart and Advanced Manufacturing Fund, and so which it's one fund cannot solve everything, but so yes, because of course there are a lot of high risk businesses that require private equity. And so, venture funding is really critical for that. But the majority of new businesses don't actually require venture capital. And that's what the problem is, right? So classically, we've always seen this tension between, if you need $6 million, then yes. But if you need $200,000, then where do you actually go? Banks have a model that isn't necessarily friendly to new businesses because new businesses can be risky. The way that we think about scoring and credit history and reliability of repayment or expectation of repayment would render a lot of new businesses, potentially unattractive. And so we have this problem where there is actually a huge set of new businesses that doesn't need venture capital, wouldn't be appropriate for venture capital, and can't get bank loans. So I think that, and that's where, I think our capital market mechanisms, and there are very interesting initiatives to address this now, but our capital market mechanisms are not particularly well suited for the types of businesses that, might not grow at exponentially high rates, but might still be pretty stable in growth and use technology, export, and create jobs, and particularly in places like Indiana. So I think it's yes and no. Yeah.
So what you're referring to are the 3 F's of funding: family, friends, and fools.
I would not say fools. And I don't know anyone in my family that would give me a loan, but yeah, I think, there's, and that's where I've seen in particular, the role of the philanthropic sector has been pretty significant, especially in the Heartland and the Heartland Midwest, in trying to basically build up our capital markets so that they are more friendly to the types of companies that have been underserved, particularly geographically.
Yeah. We actually got a comment from Dimitri here about the charging. He's suggesting that induction charging on highways will solve this problem. And I think that's maybe down the road a ways, no pun intended. So, okay, kind of bring a little international flavor to this a bit more. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was an agreement that was, negotiated with the United States and a number of other Asian countries. Donald Trump and I guess Hillary Clinton, they all kind of came out against it during the 2016 election. You think that would have been a good thing for us to be engaged with in the end, or not? You're muted there, Sam. Sammy.
I don't know. I think partnerships, particularly with countries that have pretty strong domestic policy agendas around technology and manufacturing, would provide opportunity for learning. And so it's hard to say. I think COVID has changed a lot of things, but I think we probably, in national security relevant sectors, there may have been some pressure on China. Yeah, but the counterfactual is really tough, so I don't,
Okay.
What do you think, Ray?
Well, I'm an internationalist, so I think more agreements that we have with other countries, probably the better off we're going to be.
Yeah.
It really kind of, I think, opened the door for China to be much more aggressive with many of those other countries. Yeah,
I think China would have, I think pressure on China would, the question is how much pressure would have been created, and would it have changed things? But I think there's also a lot to learn from there's a lot of learning that we can do in the US from the way that some of the particularly rapidly manufacturing growing Asian countries have handled their industrial policy.
I have a little anecdote about chip manufacturing. I used to teach at Ball State and in international business, and we actually toured a Delco plant in Kokomo that made chips. This is in the early 90s, I believe. And as we were talking to them, one of the suggestions they made was that we can't make this competitively, but we want to do this to keep our skill level up in terms of our ability to make chips. Well, that lasted a couple of years, and eventually they shut the plant down and then stopped making chips. But they had the right idea to start with, but they, in the end, they couldn't carry through with it.
Yeah, I think when you talk about international partnerships, the questions around things like allied shoring and nearshoring are really interesting, right? Particularly around allied shoring, because it's there's a lot of potential mutual gains that you can get from that kind of approach, and I'm curious to see what happens, to those conversations around allied shoring in particular.
So we had a song at the beginning about labor organizing. So I kind of have a question for you about, does organized labor have any role in this process of competitiveness? And kind of just an issue about this is that Biden came out and suggested that we would give an additional tax credit to EV manufacturers that use union labor and manufactured in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a thought about that?
Yeah. I think we keep trying to band-aid or manipulate solutions to problems that are caused by something that we don't want to address. And so in this case, I think, we are in a labor market where we see how difficult it is for people to work. And by that, I mean, we have structural barriers to work that include caregiving, which we've known about for decades, but, really only became part of the national consciousness during COVID. But things like caregiving, things like penalties for having a history of incarceration or having been incarcerated and not being able to access the job market, health insurance being tied to your employer. So transportation costs. And so, labor organizing, of course, is important because there isn't a lot of opportunity otherwise for labor to have a voice and to work for better conditions. But I think fundamentally, we always want to think about, why are our conditions for labor so bad? And why is it so difficult for people to work? So I think, of course, things like that are important. But I think the long game with labor is to really think about the way that we have structured our labor force and what we expect of workers in this country.
Okay, thank you. Betty has a question she'd like to ask.
It's more a comment than a question. Next week in our final week, you may know that our last program is on the Quad Alliance, which is going to deal with Japan, Australia, and India, and the US as part of the Quad in dealing with China. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure some of this will come up. And there's an article also in the publication, and it might just add to your own research. Or come next week and ask really great questions and start a great conversation going. That might be really good too, if you can join us next week, because this is very interesting. And China is, while the world is caught up with Russia right now, it's really Putin. China is the huge elephant in the room that we'll certainly get back to China in due time. And so if you can join us next week, that would be really great.
Okay, thanks, Betty. Going back to the issue of spending on R&D, where should that money be directed? I mean, at what level should most R&D go towards basic scientific research? Should it go into commercialization, moving basic ideas to commercialization? Where do you see the balance of spending from the government on that?
Yeah, so that's where I think you have to make some trade-offs. We've got to play the long game there too, and I think that game is about pathways into R&D and STEM. So we see that in particular, a lot of young people are not able to participate and stay on the path or get on the path to innovation types of training, to getting engineering degrees, to being R&D ready or R&D work ready. And that, I think, is a huge problem over time. And so I think some of the efforts to, for example, create culturally relevant instruction in engineering, to expand access to underrepresented groups so that we can build up that core of future R&D people in labs and in manufacturing companies as well. That, I think, is one component. And that's something that you see being undertaken not just at the federal level, but this is where I think universities and regional alliances can play a really important role. And there is a lot of awareness that we are losing people. We've also seen this sort of longstanding problem, for example, with women engineers not staying in those engineering roles in manufacturing companies. And so there's leakage there too that I think we can address. And that is addressed often at the kind of regional industry level. At the federal level, the idea around support for technology commercialization through programs like SBR, I think, is really promising. So, we have really good results from those types of programs, and making them more broadly accessible is important. Investments in NSF that we see being discussed, investments at the national level in the basic infrastructure for technology advancement is also another area. So if we can, for example, lower costs for AI, not just AI training, but access to digital infrastructure, computing infrastructure, that actually then also reduces the cost of entry for new firms that can commercialize new innovation. So from an R&D perspective, I don't think you choose one. I think we really are in a position to choose many, but that's where I think public-private partnerships, as well as the role of industry collaboratives and universities all working together, can be much more impactful than relying specifically on one policy mechanism, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. We had a question here from Alan or Marilyn. I'm not sure who's asking the question, but if you could ask the question, I'm sorry, I could not find your question. You had a question about the National Development Bank. So if you had a specific question, or maybe Sammy, you could, are you familiar with the National Development Bank? Or? You're muted again, Sammy.
No, I was just saying, I don't see a question.
Yeah,
Well,
Marilyn, is Ellen and Marilyn Shapiro, are you on? We'd like to ask this.
Nope.
I'm gonna look to see if we can find you here.
All right, well, maybe we could move on to Nat's question here. Talking about demand. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Alan. Go ahead.
So I had the question I posed was regarding national development banks. Who would the stakeholders be? Second, would they be set up on a not-for-profit basis? And thirdly, what kind of flexibility would you seek from both federal and state governments to support them? Can you expand on those questions? Thank you.
I would love to know the answer. I would not set up a national development bank, but I would like to know the answers. I just don't have them.
What exactly would the role of Alan? What exactly would a role of a national development bank be? You're muted, Alan.
Sorry, okay. So look, if you would parallel them to global institutions such as the European Development Bank, the World Bank Group here in the US, the Asian Development Bank, these are multilateral investment banks that basically are, their stakeholders comprise member governments. They are excluded from taxation, and they reinvest all their profits for new development in businesses and government grants in the developing world. That's the parallel. If you're going to mention a national development bank in your presentation, you need to have something attached to it that you can describe it by.
Yeah, so this was an example of what other countries are using. And I think the function of something like a national development bank, and I've heard interesting proposals around there should be a bank specific for manufacturing, or there should be a bank specific for an industry. I think when you start doing that, what we're looking at is then creating a very specific financing mechanism that would effectively be like picking winners, right? And so I think you have to be a little bit careful in terms of where the National Development Bank will invest and whether those investments are going to be in developing things like infrastructure for industry, things like training programs for manufacturers, versus what you might see, particularly, I guess, state-specific banks, not like the World Bank, but state-specific banks, or what you might see China doing, which is investing in specific companies, right? So to sort of clarify, when I think about a national development bank approach, or even a multilateral approach, I'm thinking about things like more broadly developing infrastructure, creating lending packages that would allow regional and state governments to build up the needs for competitiveness so that you could see those companies start. I think we get into risky territory when we start thinking about who is directly receiving funding. And so, so that's where I would sort of draw the line. But I don't necessarily think that a national development bank approach is the answer. I just think it's one of the options to make these sort of broader investments.
Okay, thanks.
Right, thank you. Nat, are you on? You had kind of a extensive question here. Maybe you'd be better off asking it yourself. Nat, Whitney, you out there still? Maybe, maybe not. I'll kind of summarize a little bit. Right? You there?
I guess so. I don't see myself, but I hear myself.
Yes.
All right. We hear you.
Yeah, I was just thinking that the driver for these entrepreneurs to become successful is the demand, and the demand will come from outside of the entrepreneurs.
Mhm.
And I just wondered if that was your opinion also. And then what do we do about that? It occurs to me that China, for one thing, they're investing in infrastructure in some of the poorer countries. And as those economies developed, they can spend more money on the Chinese goods. Should we be thinking along those same lines?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the opportunity for new business really obviously comes from changes in demand. I think what we see, though, particularly around the technology side and the R&D side, is that our ability to respond to that demand with enough people that don't face barriers to starting and growing a business is not adequate. So there are many people who are able to or want to respond to need and changes in the marketplace. I mean, we've certainly seen that during COVID. We've seen a lot of shifts that have certainly hurt a lot of businesses, but we've also seen a lot of new businesses respond to those shifts. And so I think what we're really faced with is, how do we remove barriers that prevent people from responding to these opportunities that are, created by shifts in demand? And those are the types of barriers that could include capital markets, but also ability to scale, intellectual property protections that would actually prevent people from taking something where they see the opportunity to respond and turning it into a viable business that can grow. So, yeah, I mean, I think, demand is really the crucial sort of first driver.
Okay, thank you. One of the things I've thought about is the shift from researcher to entrepreneur by university professors.
Yeah.
And I think this is a relatively new phenomenon, as money has become available for, especially as universities see this as an opportunity to have spin-off businesses where they have some payback from professors starting up businesses. Just curious whether you think this is a good trend or not, whether this distracts professors from continuing to do other research that might be valuable because they get so enamored with their businesses that they stop paying attention to their first job and start worrying about their second job.
No, I think it's a good thing. And I think, Bayh-Dole was obviously crucial in shaping this. But no, I think
who was she?
Sorry, Bayh-Dole, the Bayh-Dole Act.
Okay.
And so I think if that doesn't happen, then the situation would be that you see a lot of innovation taking place and but very little making it to market, right? Because the problem is the technical work is being done by people who then would not be able to follow through and drive the expansion of that work. on the other hand, there is a problem with technical people or scientists then running companies, right? Because you don't learn how to do that when you're studying, when you're getting your qualifications. But so I think it's some of these, and I think there's also a lot of leakage. So there's a lot that is happening at university labs and university partnerships that isn't making it to the market, and that's a real problem too. So yeah, in general, I think it's good for companies to come out of university-based research, whether it's the professor themselves or it's a postdoc or it's a team that comes out of it. Universities and tech transfer support are a really big priority in regional economic development strategies, so they play a role. We also see that there's a real role for university industry partnerships there, and that the more access that university scientists have to what is cutting edge in the industry, the better it is. So I certainly think it's a good thing for innovations that come out of a university to be commercialized in the private sector. If it's the professor that does it, I don't know that it, I don't know that it has to be the professor that does it, but it should be done, right? Because in many cases, this is work that's also funded using federal dollars and other types of public money, and that has potential, huge welfare gains for the population.
All right, thank you. Dimitri had another question here. Do you think there's a developed economy somewhere that serves as a good example for industrial policy that might be a model that the United States or any other country might follow?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say, when you start saying industrial policy, it becomes, a little tricky. But I think that innovation policy and particularly focused around technology in Finland has been really interesting. And so they have basically, the Finnish government has had a really big priority, especially on R&D in the national economic policy framework. And that has been very, very impressive. So they set targets for R&D and use a number of policy mechanisms to achieve those. And so I think that's one example of where R&D cuts across the economy. So it's not specifically in one area. And the basic understanding is, it's a small country, and this is something that really sets it apart and fuels its economy. And so I think what is happening, or what's been happening in Finland with innovation policy, is probably a really interesting thing for the United States to learn from.
Okay, what happened? I just lost my, sorry. So I had a question about industrial spying. We have a lot of kind of complaints from US companies that China is stealing entrepreneurial ideas and new startup ideas. Do you think this is a problem, or is this?
Yes. Yes. By any means necessary. Yes, it's a problem. And it is a problem for a lot of reasons. One of the big ones is obviously, creating the innovation or even the foundational pieces of the innovation, and then not being able to host the companies that scale it creates, a huge amount of loss. So yeah, I think the acquiring, the strategy of acquiring foreign tech and foreign innovation by any means necessary is a problem. Yeah.
Right.
Big one.
Yes. Is there a way to stop this, or what is?
I am not it's not my area.
All right. Larry, did you have a comment here you want to make?
Well, this really builds on that. There are politicians now who are saying that China is not just a competitor,
Yeah.
but really an enemy that intends to prosper themselves by diminishing our own success in the marketplace. And I'm really curious, is Chinese growth really a zero-sum kind of a game? I mean, if they prosper, if they continue to bring more hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, does that necessarily mean that we can't continue to prosper? I know they play by different rules, but do you see it as a zero-sum game? And should we think of it? We're so integrated with our economies, and so we can't say they're the enemy. We're no longer going to deal with them.
No.
So do you see it as a zero-sum game, or how can we continue to compete effectively and both countries perhaps prosper?
Yeah, I think that's really up to the political sphere, right? It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game at all. In fact, it could be a very, very good game for everybody. But I think that's where, obviously political priorities and ideology get in the way, right? So, but no, it doesn't have to be. It never has to be. And, I think, Ray, it was you that said that, the more cooperation there is, the better it is. And I don't see why, in theory, a large country like China couldn't be a very good collaborator, except that it's China and that the political situation won't allow it.
Well, I think we've kind of run out of questions here for this evening. Jerry, you had a question? You're muted, Jerry.
I guess I got a question and a comment. I read recently that a lot of Chinese companies are buying American companies, and pretty significant American companies, and that in many locales in the US now, the people that are working for the #1 industry will be working for a Chinese company. So is that a strategy they're using to help penetrate into the US?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, it's a risk. It's a risk in any industry, but particularly in manufacturing. Yeah. And I think that the problem is our ability to even wrap our heads around something like that is a bit limited, because we think of companies and deals where companies are being sold and or selling or merging, but where company decision making is something that happens by itself, right? And we've been stuck in this way of thinking for a long time, so we don't actually take stock of what happens when 10 companies sell to one Chinese company in a region. And so I think part of that just really demonstrates that we really need to be thinking about our domestic economic competitiveness when we are thinking about our relationship with China, right? Because that's also that kind of thing is also difficult to track sometimes. I mean, it's trackable, but it can be tricky also, the way that accounting reporting is done as well, what's being sold, how it's being reported. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we should be more worried about.
That's especially an issue given the difficulty it is for American companies to operate in China on a reciprocal basis. So, yeah. Okay, Betty, you want to take us home here?
Thank you very much. I think you've taken a topic that can be very confusing, and you've made it very understandable and very clear. And you addressed all of our questions. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'll send you the slides. I apologize. I don't know why they didn't show up.
No. So some people did ask if the slides would be available. If you send us the slides, we can then share them.
Yeah. Yes.
Great. Thank you. No, this was really great. Thank you very, very much. And please come back.
I will.
Next week or every week. Yes, we would love to have you stay with us. And so I'm really glad Claire was able to identify you as our speaker for this evening, because you did a wonderful job of making a topic which could be a little lofty, very, very clear and very real for us. So thank you very much. Once again, a reminder that next week is our last week. And it feels a little sad to say that because we've had a really wonderful year with you this year. We've enjoyed having you with us. Thank you, John. We've enjoyed having you with us. Now, Larry did not get back with me. I'm going to share this anyway. Larry is on our board. He's the president of our board. And he shared with us in a text message as we were playing our songs that Joan Baez brought back wonderful memories because he heard her sing this live at Woodstock. And I just think that's very, very cool. So I hope you don't mind my sharing that. It doesn't age us because we're ageless. I just know that Woodstock is an event I did not get to make. I had a pretty cool youth, like many of you, but that was, I got thinking, well, I'll get to that next one. And I don't think there's ever quite a next Woodstock. So that was pretty cool. Thank you for sharing that with us, Larry.
It does age me, though.
Tell you about it's a cool one. Pardon me, what, Larry?
No, I said that does age me, doesn't it?
No. We are ageless. We are absolutely ageless.
Yeah.
No. So, well, I mean, Joan Baez is still alive. We're all still here. So it's just really, really great. The Quad Alliance, and this is, I had mentioned earlier, this is an alliance between Japan, Australia, India, and the United States on China. And not quite a NATO alliance, but basically an alliance along the lines of what we were discussing this evening. It is a strategic alliance and all things that China could pose threats to, which includes, of course, the business, the manufacturing, security issues in the South China Seas and beyond. China has very, very ambitious problems, and they're probably delighting in the fact that right now all eyes are on Europe. Is not Putin, but Russia is invading Ukraine. I always like to make that differentiation because we cannot necessarily blame the Russian people for Putin, but there he is. In any event, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And then I believe, Larry, do you want to tell us about the upcoming, do we have a Distinguished Speakers Program for April?
We do. On April 21st, that's the third weekend of April, we're going to do a really interesting program on conspiracy theories, the history of conspiracy theories, the fact that they're universal, what causes some of these things, what some of the implications and consequences are of conspiracy theories, and particularly in the age of social media with the rapid distribution of real and unreal information, around the world. So I think it's going to be a really fascinating program, and it's pretty relevant right now with what's going on around the world. We've also seen some of these things right here in our very own country. So I think it's going to be a good program. And then we'll wrap the year in the May program on addressing world hunger, which has become it's the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 2 to eliminate hunger. And in the face of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, it's extremely a precarious situation around the world. So we have 2 really good distinguished speaker programs coming up in April and May, and please come back and join us for those.
Yes.
And this program will be available, on our website after tomorrow. So it's been recorded. So if you want to watch it again or pass it along to a friend, you can, and you can see those slides and hear the conversation again.
Yeah, Ukraine has been called the breadbasket of for many countries, for much of Europe for a very long time, and not just in recent years, but even preceding the 20th century. And it is true that there are countries that are really largely dependent upon food from Ukraine, wheat from Ukraine. And so the situation is just enormously tragic beyond words that we can express. I think that what we're pointing out also is our subjects are timely. We are given the subjects for great decision, and they're always, this is put together by the Foreign Policy Association working with the World Affair Councils of America, and they're always timely, and they've turned out to be absolutely urgent this year. We have control over the subjects that we want to talk about and distinguished speakers, and we make sure that the subjects are timely and they are urgent, they're relevant. We're glad you're joining us. So please come back and see us. Larry, did you want me to stay on a bit so we could chat?
That would be fine. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Hey, Sammy, I have everybody else can go. I just have a personal question for you.
Yeah.
Have